Hi everyone, I'm Jane, and today we are going to do our first ever watercolor tutorial. Now I'm super excited about this one and I hope that you are too. And this painting is based on the acrylic version that we did earlier this month. And if you haven't seen that one, you can just click the information iCard right up here and you can see it there. If you're brand new to watercolor and you don't know what kind of watercolor paint to use, honestly just use whatever you have or whatever you can get. If you'd like to know exactly what I used, you can check out the video description below for a list of materials, as well as a link to my website where you can find affiliate links to all of the products that I've used here today. Now let's get started. Okay, so here I have everything I'm gonna need to do my bird watercolor painting. And I've got a sheet of paper. This is 7 by 10, and I've taped it down to the back of an old canvas board. I don't want to tape it down to my table because I like to have the option of picking the board up and moving it around if I want. I've got my watercolors here that come in the tubes, and then I just squeezed them into these little containers in my palette and let them dry. And then whenever I'm ready to use them, I just dribble some water on the surface of them. As you can see, some of them are kind of pooled a little bit, and that gets them ready to use. I also do have a bottle of the Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus paint, and this is white and it's watercolor paint, so it is on the transparent side. If you don't have white watercolor paint, you can use watered down acrylic paint or gouache, whatever you have, and you can skip this part if you like. Now I know a lot of people say, oh, never use white watercolor. When somebody tells me never, I tend to do it anyway. I have a pencil and it says soft, so this is going to be a pencil that will show up nicely on our paper, but should be a lot easier to erase. And then I have this gum eraser, and I like these gum erasers because they seem to take the pencil off of the paper very, very easily with minimal damage to the paper. And that's important because if you scrub at the paper too much with an eraser, you'll kind of rough up the surface and it can affect your watercolor. And these are just my detail brushes that I sell. I use the same brushes for both acrylic and watercolor with no problem. Next, I have a jar of water, and this is really important. This is what I'm going to clean my brushes in. And then I have this little jar of water, and this is where I'm going to get clean water from. With watercolor, even more so than acrylic, it's important that you have two water sources so that you don't muddy up your water. If your water has even a little bit of color in it, it can affect the color that you put down on your paper. And I have a paper towel. You're absolutely going to want at least one paper towel. We are going to use this paper towel to death today. Okay, so I'm going to start by sketching out my image. And I'm going to start with my branch just to make sure I have room for my bird. Notice I'm holding my pencil back far. I'm not going to crank down on it like this because then I run the risk of putting too much pressure and too much graphite onto my paper. That'll make it hard to erase later. So I'm going to work very, very loosely, just kind of say my branch is right about here. Hopefully you can see these pencil lines. Let's see, maybe we'll bring that out just a little bit more. And then I have another branch coming off here. This is essentially going to be the same painting that I did in acrylic. It might be a little bit different. Got another branch that kind of comes up here. My flowers are going to be there, and now I can draw in my bird. So just kind of a loose oval shape for the bird. Make sure you don't put him all the way down on the branch so we have room for his legs. Just a little hint of a tail. And his head. I'm really drawing him pretty much the same way as I did in the acrylic version. He's going to look totally different though. And his beak is right about here. And then I'm going to take my gum eraser and I'm going to erase all of the lines that I don't need. Make sure you don't scrub down on that paper again because you'll remove the top layer of the paper. And any lines that I do need, if they're too dark, I'm going to run over them with the eraser and just lighten them a bit so that I don't have to worry about them showing after we've painted the bird. So right there, that's a bit dark. I'm just going to lightly wipe over it, lighten it a bit. I know you probably won't be able to see my pencil lines too much at this point, but we're gonna start painting them in, so it won't matter. As long as you can see it when you're working on yours, that's all that matters. Okay, so when we paint in our bird, we're gonna work very, very loosely. I'm gonna try and make this as simple as possible because I know a lot of you have probably never used watercolor before, so I don't wanna get too terribly detailed with him. I'm gonna use my number 6 round brush, and I'm gonna wet it in my water jar. Remember, this is my clean water. So there's a good amount of water in here. I'm gonna come right over to my ultramarine, pull some over here, and I know I don't wanna go too bright with this, at least not right off the bat. I'm gonna grab another drip of water, or I'm sorry, I don't wanna go too dark with it. We want to work from our lightest colors to our darkest colors, so I'm gonna really water this down. And we'll see how that goes. Now I don't want to take my brush, it's super loaded up with paint. If I put it on here, it's really just going to kind of puddle on my paper. In fact, what I'm going to do, just roll some of that off, cleaned off my brush, wipe it off, get some of my clean water, and I'm going to use my brush flat. I'm going to lay my brush flat and I'm just going to kind of wipe it very loosely wherever I know I want that blue. You don't want puddles. I don't know if you can see in there how much water is on my paper. What you're looking for is you want to be able to tell when you look at your paper that it's wet, but you don't want to be able to see a puddle. So if you don't see the texture of the paper through the water, then it's a puddle. If you can see the texture of the paper, then you're probably good. So I just kind of took that through his head, down this part of his shoulder, down his wing area, and through his tail, right there. Now I'm gonna pick up a little bit of my color, that watery color, and I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna start, Mr. Moon's contributing to my painting. I'm gonna start on his face, because right here at the front of his face is where I know I want it to be the darkest. See, I've got my brush pressed flat again. Run that down his back. See, it's very, very faint. Down his shoulder here. Cleaned off my brush, wipe it on my paper towel. I'm gonna come back right here in. I started from outside his head and moved in because I like in watercolors when not all of the edges are defined. And so by leaving this area white, it will kind of say that his head is really highlighted and light back there. But we don't need any hard lines. Get just a little more of that color. See, I'm kind of rolling my brush and pulling it away, and that gets off some of the color, the extra paint and water. And let's just do that a little bit again. Right there where we know we want it darker. Right down through here. Still using my brush just flat, not trying to fill it all in. Washed off my brush, wipe it on my paper towel. If you have an area with a line that's too hard, after you wash your brush and wipe it off, lay your brush flat with the belly of the brush, so the middle of the brush right on that line, and just wipe right over it. And that will help soften it. Get rid of any extra paint that you don't want. I'm gonna soften this too. I don't want a hard line there. Let's put a little color in his chest. So I'm gonna get some of this yellow ochre, just a little bit of that, quite a bit of water. I want it to be very thin, very watery color. Roll some of that off. And I'm gonna come into his chest here and just flat. Just break up that line. See, it's almost just kind of implied. And that's what watercolor does. Watercolor lends itself really well to working really, really loosely. So allow yourself to work really loosely. Let's get a little bit more ultramarine into that mixture. So this color is going to be a little bit more saturated. Still kind of rolling off extra paint. And again, I'm going to come into the front of his face, still using my brush kind of flat. Every time you see me go like this with my paper towel, that's when I've cleaned it off. So even if I don't tell you, if you see me doing that, I've just cleaned off my brush. If you have too much color, I think that wing is a little solid colored. Picked up some of my clean water and I'm just lightly wiping it on my paper towel so I don't have too much water. I'm gonna come around in here, still flat. Just kind of get in there. And see, that takes away some of the color. That's especially easy if you get to it before it dries all the way. If it dries all the way, with some brands, you can come back and re-wet it and fix it up, but with some brands, it's a little bit harder. I'm gonna break up that line and just let what comes off kind of fill in that white space a little bit. Don't worry about having super hard edges or, you know, your colors overlapping or going outside of your line. Let's get a little bit of Payne's gray, just a little bit. Some water. I want a very thin color here. If you don't have Payne's gray, you could use black. I would use a tiny bit of black and maybe put in some ultramarine, or use an ultramarine burnt umber black. And this is going to be darker than I want, but that's okay. I'm just kind of scrubbing it in to this general area. And then break that up. I'm going to get it up into that yellow color. And I don't really want it there. So a dry brush and I can just kind of roll it off. Let's get a little more ultramarine and make that first mixture a little bit more saturated. Right there in front of his face. Maybe down this side a bit. Down the inside of his wing. Under his tail for sure. It's going to be nice and dark under there. There's some shadow. And notice I am working kind of quickly. And that's not because I'm practiced and I'm a pro at this. I am by no means a pro at watercolor. I haven't been doing it for very long, but I'm super enjoying it, so I really wanted to share it with you. But the reason I'm working quickly is to avoid working stiff. It's really easy, especially if you are used to acrylic. It's really easy to work super tight. And so I intentionally work super fast and loose in watercolor so that I can avoid that. Now notice in our bird, the only hard lines that I have is really right here, and that's where his wing meets his chest. Over here, that's where feathers of one color meet feathers of another color, so there might be a little bit of blending there. But right here I have a little bit of a harder line, just to keep some definition there between the two areas. But let's feather a little bit, because I don't want, you know, just like a solid line there. Break it up a little bit. I'm just using the tip of my brush, as you can see, just to kind of insinuate some darker areas. A lot of this is still wet, so it's kind of taking that paint and spreading out. Remember that when you put paint in an area that's already wet, see how when I touch, it kind of feathers out? So when you put paint in an area that's already wet, that paint is going to move. If you put paint in an area that's dry, that paint is going to stay there and you'll get a hard edge. So that's how I got this hard edge. The belly was pretty much dry when I swiped down it. But over here, I got a soft edge because both of these areas were wet when those colors were laid in. So those colors were allowed to kind of mingle and overlap. Let's grab a little bit of Payne's gray. Make sure you can see what I'm doing. A little bit of Payne's gray, I'm gonna mix it in with that blue. So see, now I have kind of a midnight blue color. And we're gonna start working on a few shadow areas. So I know I want his face to be a little darker than everything else on his head. And I'm not really swiping, I'm just kind of touching the tip of the brush because that's still all wet. See how it's kind of carrying it? I'm not worried if I get too much, if it's too dark. I'm not worried about that right now. Don't worry about that. Just take a hint of it over there, maybe just a hint of it in there. Put little bits of it here. Just with the tip of my brush. And a good amount here under his tail where it's nice and dark from a shadow. Now, watch this, clean brush. I'm gonna dry it on my paper towel. See, I kind of squeezed it. I'm gonna come into his face here. I've got a little bit of a puddle. I'm just gonna touch the tip of the brush to it. I'm not touching the paper, I'm only touching that puddle, the top of the puddle. See, and now the puddle's gone. The difference between touching the paper and touching the puddle is if you touch the paper, see how much it removed? But if you just touch the puddle, the color stays, it just takes some of the water. Touching the paper there to break up that line. Touching the paper here to pick up a little bit more color because I felt like that was too dark. Touching the puddle right here just to get some of that extra water up. Let's put his beak in because he looks kind of strange right now without a beak. So I'm gonna go to my number 2 round brush, a little bit of water and some Payne's gray. I'm gonna start drawing his beak in just with the very tip of my brush. Now, because the face of my bird is still wet, some of this Payne's gray is going to get picked up and spread into the face. And that's exactly what I want. If you don't want that, then you'll want to wait until the face is dry. I'm going to take that into the face just a little bit too, just the tip of the brush. See that? I'm not going flat. I'm not making brush strokes. I'm just kind of nudging the very tip of the brush into that wet paint. If his beak is too dark, you can just come back in with that clean brush. Just lay it flat and pick some of that up. See? And now it's much lighter than it was. Let's travel a little bit of that darker color through the face a bit more. And if it decides it's done spreading, or it's starting to get muddy or too mixed up or whatever, just leave it alone. Let's get a hint of that dark color in there too. There we go, I like that. See how that didn't spread? That little spot? That's because the paper's dry right there. You can either leave that, or if you don't like it, clean dried off brush, put the belly of your brush right on it, and just kind of wipe at it. There we go. No more. And this is still that ultramarine Payne's gray mixture. And I'm just gonna kind of slash it, flat brush. Just kind of slashing some of it down the wing. My color's a little thinner than I need there. Let's work on his chest for just a minute. So I'm gonna get a little bit of burnt umber. And I think I'll just mix it in with this yellow. There we go. Let's put a little drop of water in there to thin it down a bit. And right over here, I'm just gonna go like that. That's it. And just break it up down here at the bottom. Maybe just a little bit at the top too. Leave some of your lines distinct with an edge. So see, I've got an edge there, I've got an edge there. Everything else is kind of fuzzy. I think that's one of the things that makes watercolor so interesting. I'm just gonna add a tiny hint of that color down through here too. Maybe just a hint right there. Now remember, if I decide that's way too dark, clean, dry brush, I can just kind of touch into it and remove a little bit of it. So you're just kind of moving up into it. That clean, dry brush, kind of pick some of that up. Let's add a tiny bit more of that Payne's gray down in here. Belly of the brush to break up that line. A little more Payne's gray. Let's kind of kick the lowlights on him a bit. Mix it in with that ultramarine blue mixture and see how dark that color is. It's super dark, but it's not black. I feel like I'm almost done with him, with the main part of him anyway. Oh, you know what I forgot? I forgot something. All right, I cleaned off my brush. I'm gonna dry it off pretty good on my paper towel. Right up here in his shoulder, I'm gonna take some of that blue away. See, as long as you get to it before it's completely dry, you can make changes. Let's get a bit of that color out of there. Perfect. A little bit of that yellow. Kind of drop that in there. Because remember, he's got like a little band. That brownish color kind of moves around his neck. And I might have to touch that up later, but that's okay. We'll just keep going. I'll come back to it. Again with that dark color, kind of pressed flat. Flat again, just removing a bit. And if you're brand new to watercolor and this looks intimidating to you, don't worry, I promise we'll do some that are substantially easier. I just really wanted to do this one because I felt like the bird and the flowers, see, just adding little streaks of that darker color in his wings, starting to work on a bit of detail. Notice here, I'm only using just the tip of my brush. But I thought that this bird and those flowers they looked so good in watercolor. So I really wanted to do a watercolor version of this, but I promise we'll do some more simple watercolors. Just a damp brush along the back edge of those lines so that it's hard on one side and a little softer on the other. Let's get just the tiniest bit of it right over here. Really watery version of this. We'll put a bit right in here as well. Now in his chest here, I really want to kind of make that pop. So I'm going to grab a little bit of Alizarin Crimson. A little bit more burnt umber and get kind of this warm brown. Roll a good amount of that off so not too much paint. And right here, again, that's it. Just two little brush strokes with my brush flat. And then the belly of my brush, break up a couple of those lines. This really spread quite a bit. Let's see if we can do something there. I'm just kind of picking up any extra moisture that might be there. A little bit of my black blue or Payne's gray blue mixture. And let's let that dry for a minute before we add the brown back in. Just kind of clearing a path, taking out a little bit of that moisture so that blue doesn't fill all back in. We'll come back to it. I feel like I'm almost done. I just want to make kind of a little path for his eye. Just kind of give him a little bit of a lighter area, right where his eye is going to be, leading to his face. All right, let's let him dry completely, and then we'll come back and we'll make some adjustments. In the meantime, we'll work on the branches. I'm going to get some Payne's gray, plop it down over here, some burnt umber, get this nice dark brown color, add a little extra water, and I'm just going to start laying in my branches very loosely, let them kind of wobble. I'm twisting my brush a little bit, just like I did in the watercolor, or in the acrylic version, sorry. And I should have planned his tail a little bit better. Oh, that's right. We'll just go over top of it. We're going to go pretty dark with a few layers here, so it should cover. And lay in this little branch. Now before that dries, we're going to take this dry brush and we're going to come along the edge, the top edge here, and clean some of that off so it's not quite so dark up there, because we're going to add some other colors. So I'm dipping into clean water, wiping out my paper towel, and then going back. Wiping out on your paper towel is very important. If you don't, you're going to start applying a ton of water on here, and you're going to make a puddle, and you're going to lose control of your paint. Ooh, that's pretty dry right there. Let's see, I'll use just a little bit of extra water. Kind of lay it on there. Let it sit for a second. And it can come back. See, and it comes right up. Now, it's important that you know what your paints do. Not all brands of paint are going to lift this readily. So I encourage you to experiment. Play with your paints, find out how well they lift, if they stain, you know, just do a bunch of exercises and color charts, whatever. That will help you get an idea for what your paint does. If you're using like the Dr. P.H. Martin Hydrus paints, I have found that they do not lift anywhere near as readily as these Windsor Newton paints. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's what I want. I want paint that's going to stay exactly where I put it, that I can come back and layer over top of and not lift the previous color. And so if I know that I'm going to be doing some of that, then I absolutely want to use my Hydrus paints. But for something like this, where I know it's not going to lift as well, then I want to use my Windsor Newton paints. See, I'm just kind of lifting almost randomly. For the most part, it's at the top edge of my branch, but not always. Just kind of think about where you might want to see moss. because where we're lifting is pretty much where we're going to be putting moss. In fact, let's go ahead and get started on that. So I have this color here, it's called Gamboge, but that doesn't really matter. Use whatever yellow and blue you have. I really like the Gamboge. It's very, very bright and vibrant, and with ultramarine, it makes a really nice green. So see how it's almost orange when it's super concentrated. Love, love, love this color. Got a little puddle in my ultramarine there already. That might be a little brighter than I want. That's okay, I'll just grab some of, let's see, I'll just take a bit of that red color. That's kind of what I like about watercolors is I feel a little bit freer to just grab whatever colors on my palette and mix it in there. See, I was able to take that green down to a nice muted color. A little bit more natural, a little more like what I was looking for. Add a little water and kind of tone it down in the saturation a bit. Roll off some of that extra paint. And I'm going to come in here and just kind of start laying it in wherever I lifted paint. Lifted that brown. And I'm not even trying to fill all of it in. Some of it is still showing. And sometimes I take the green color over top of an area that I didn't lift. All of that is going to help you get a little bit of variation. See, don't draw a line. Don't just, paint in the entire branch with the green. See, I applied it almost randomly. Clean brush, wiped off. Let's just break up some of those lines, soften the color in some places. I'm just looking for variation. And that's all I'm wanting you to do. Just look for variation. Just decide, oh, I think I'm gonna lighten it there. Decide, oh, I like that hard line, I'm gonna leave it, but I'm gonna take this one away. There's not a right and wrong. I know that when we're first learning something, we second guess all of the decisions we make, and we think, oh, what would somebody who knew what they were doing do? Well, you can take comfort in knowing that I don't know what I'm doing. I just kind of, I'm enjoying learning about watercolor. I swore off watercolor for years, assuming that if you made a mistake, that was it. You were stuck with it. But I've discovered that that's really not true. And in a lot of ways, watercolor makes me feel a little bit more free than acrylic does with some things. There's some paintings that I have no desire to try in anything but acrylic. And there's other paintings that I've done that I'm like, I wouldn't even know how to approach this in acrylic. This seems like it was just made for watercolor. Let's just go into the Gamboge now. I'm gonna add some water, get it nice and thin. I am in love with this color. And I'm just gonna kind of touch it into some of this green. Get a few areas that are nice and bright with this mossy color. I'm not putting it on all of the green, just in some areas. And maybe in a couple places I'll put it where the green isn't. If I decide I don't like that, I can take it away or cover it up. Not a big deal. I think if you're new to watercolor, I think that the most important things you need to learn are that you start with your lightest or most transparent, less saturated colors, and you move toward your darkest, most saturated colors. And let's see, what's the other thing? Working loose. Watercolor really does whatever it wants to do, so take advantage of that. Understand that watercolor, the paint itself, has its own ideas of what it wants to do. And if you allow it to do that and don't fight it, I think that it can be very, very rewarding. I'm just taking a pinch of this Payne's gray that's pretty watered down, and I'm just adding a few little darker spots on the underside of my branch. Not painting in the whole area. and it was pretty dry, so that paint didn't spread. So I can just come in and break up with this dry brush any of these hard lines that I didn't like. Just kind of going over the line, just with the very tip of my brush. Particularly right here, that branch kind of got away from me. So I'm just going to fill it in and make it look like it didn't get away from me. I meant for the branch to be that big. Watercolor can be seriously rewarding. And I understand that it can be seriously intimidating. But don't approach it the same way as you do acrylic. If you try to do a watercolor painting expecting it to do what acrylic does, or even just applying it the way you would acrylic, then I think you're going to struggle. Okay, now let's let our branch dry. And I'm going to go back to my number 2 round, and let's give our bird his eye. So I'm going to get some Payne's gray. Good amount, pretty dark. And we're going to give him a little eye, just with the tip of the brush. While we're in that Payne's gray, actually, it's still a pretty thin version of it. I'm just going to kind of come in here and just do a few little details. Just insinuate a couple little feathery bits in here. And if I don't like them, then I can get rid of them. Or at least knock them back a bit. I think I'm going to do that here. Belly of my brush. There we go. Oh, let's put our brown back in there, because that's pretty dry. A little bit of my yellow oxide. Kind of lay that in there. Oh, much better. Little hint of that brown. Just kind of dot it. Let the water that's on there kind of take it where it's going to take it. If it's too much water, too puddled, remember, just touch the surface of the puddle with the brush. If you go all the way to the paper, you're going to make a white spot. And if you want a white spot there, then that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and take your brush all the way to the paper. Let's give him some legs. So my Payne's gray again. And we'll just come from somewhere in here, draw a leg down to the branch. If your branch is still wet, you might want to wait on the legs. I think my branch is good. I'm going to take a little toe out like that. And another little toe there. If you are one of those people who likes acrylic because of easy cleanup, then you're gonna love watercolor. It's such easy cleanup. Just a damp brush, wet all that old paint down, wipe it away with a paper towel. If I didn't have my paints that lived in this palette, I could just go run it under the faucet. There. Okay, let's do our flowers. So I'm going to use my number 8 filbert, wet it in my jar, and I'm going to start with, this is Cadmium Red Medium. Any red you have will work. Pull that over there. And I'm really going to do these the exact same way as I did in the acrylic video. So I'm just going to come in here and wet the edge of my brush. See how I'm using on the edge, not flat, but I'm going to go back and forth So we'll say like that, maybe like that. Kind of random. We'll have another one over here. Let's get a little bit of Gamboge. And we'll get a couple in there, and I love the way that it pulls that red into it. And a little bit of alizarin. Just kind of like one here and there. You know, those are kind of puddled. I think I'm gonna let those flowers dry before I continue with the alizarin. Let's do the stems. So I'm gonna get a little Gamboge, a little ultramarine, some of that red color again. Maybe some of that red color. And just want to tone it down. See, I can go into a million different colors on my palette until I've got the right one. I don't feel like I have to be quite as precise with my colors with watercolor as with acrylic. I'm just going to decide that's kind of a large cluster. Bring a little bit down. Don't let it touch your flower though, especially where those flowers are still wet, because you might suck some of the green into it. And sometimes that would be okay, but I feel like for these colors, that's not what I want to see. And we'll put a little bud right in there. Maybe another one right there. Whoops. Got my green in that flower. That's okay. You can either decide it's not a big deal and leave it, or take your dry brush and just kind of touch that, take it off. While everything's drying, I'm just gonna get some Gamboge with some water, sorry. I'm just gonna kind of pop a few bright spots on the moss in here. And then everything should be pretty dry and we can finish up. Let's actually take a little drip of water. I'm going to put it into the end of each one of these buds, because my buds are pretty much dry. So just kind of let that sit there for a second. Clean my brush, dry it really good on my paper towel, and then I'm going to come back and touch all the way down to the paper, and look, removed a lot of that dark color in the tip of the buds, because I want to make the tip of the buds a little bit brighter with some Gamboge. I'm going to put that in there. There we go. I like that. Okay, I've got my white watercolor, and this white is not very opaque. I know you think white, opaque, it's going to cover everything. It's really not. Still using my number 2. I'll load up with some of that. And we're going to start giving him just a few little details. So right around the bottom edge of his eye, it is going to dry a little bit more transparent than that. A little around the top of his eye. Little dot in there. If you happen to get too much of the white and think he looks creepy, Then clean dry brush, just run the tip of it over, but notice my brush is kind of flat. A little more, let's give him a little bit of some lighter spots right here behind his eye, just kind of scribbling that on. You will be able to see it, but it won't cover like titanium white. Just kind of slash a few of those through there. Maybe just a couple little highlights. See, just kind of scribbling with the tip. Let's get a couple going on in here. Actually, I don't want to do that. I'm going to take this loaded up and flat, and I'm going to go there. That's all the highlight he needs there. Maybe one right there where his wing meets his tail, just to make sure that we've got that differentiation. And maybe just a little slash right there in his belly. See, you can still see, even though those colors there were super pale, you can still see them. I like to use a little bit of white. But like I said, I know there's people who, one of their rules to watercolor is never use white watercolor paint. I think they make it for a reason, and if you can figure out a way to use it in a way that you like, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm going to take a tiny point of it, just right there on top of his beak. And so you can already tell that that is fading as it dries. It's not drying opaque white. But I am going to lift just a tiny bit of that anyway. There we go. Oops, I dribbled on him. Take that off immediately so it doesn't get the opportunity to re-wet the paint. Okay, I think our flowers are about dry and we should be good to go ahead and finish them. So let's get our alizarin again. And we'll just kind of dash alizarin here and there. Just going to grab a little point of ultramarine and mix it in there with it. Actually, no, I'm not, because that makes a nice bright purple. I did that in the acrylic video too. I don't know what my problem is with this cadmium red phthalo ultramarine blue. See, I don't even know what colors I'm using. All right, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, nice dark color, but very little paint. Wipe a lot of that off. And just come in here to where you put some alizarin and just kind of touch it into there. Not a ton. You don't want it to start spreading and taking over. And I feel like I'm pretty happy with that. I think I'm done. So I'm just going to go ahead and sign him. Okay, now once it's completely dry, and that's very important, you want to make sure that everything touching the tape is completely dry before you do the next part. We're going to remove the tape, and I'm going to show you how to do it. Because if you do it wrong, Mr. Moon, get down. If you do it wrong, you can tear your paper. So, we're going to start with this one, and you want to pull it away from the canvas. You don't want to just pull it straight up, because that will shred your paper. So you want to grab the edge, and you want to peel it away like that. Mr. Moon decided that he is absolutely coming up on the table. So see how I'm pulling it that way. And it's not tearing the paper at all. Do it nice and slow, don't get impatient. Now, if your paper is still wet, if you pull straight up, or if you pull the tape too fast, you'll shred your paper. Don't drink paint water, kitty. When this paint water thing is on my table, he always tries to drink out of it. Mr. Moon, you're a pest. Go away. Okay, let's see if I can peel this tape without Mr. Moon getting all up in my business again. And there's our painting. Now we can go ahead and get rid of those last couple pencil marks. And we can call our first watercolor painting done. And there is our super cute spring bluebird, all done in watercolor. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope it helped get you a little bit excited to try watercolor if you've never tried it before. It's something that I've been playing with since about late October, so by no means am I a pro at it. But I see the possibilities with watercolor, and I'm really excited about some of the things that I feel free to do and try with this medium. And I'm really excited to share that with you as well. If you like this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button because there's more on the way. Thank you as always for painting with me, everyone, and I'll see you next time.